When Calvin Candie first appears on screen, Tarantino is careful about what he shows us before he shows us anything ugly. We see wealth, we see hospitality, we see a man who seems genuinely pleased to have guests, who talks about his property with pride, who treats Django and Schultz with a kind of theatrical warmth that almost feels welcoming. Candyland looks less like a plantation and more like a stage set for a man who has decided, somewhere along the way, that he is the most interesting person in any room he enters. This matters because Tarantino wants the audience to register Candie the way the other characters in the film register him at first, as a charming, slightly absurd, slightly excessive Southern gentleman. He laughs easily, he performs generosity, he likes being looked at. There is a version of Calvin Candie that exists purely on the surface, and that version is almost likable, in the way a showman can be likable before you notice what the show is covering up. The contrast Tarantino is building from the very first scene is between Candie's self-presentation and what that presentation is built on top of. He wants to be seen as refined, hospitable, and intelligent. Underneath that performance is a man whose comfort, charm, and confidence all depend entirely on owning other human beings. The film does not rush to expose this. It lets Candie be charming for a while because the charm itself is the point. He believes his own performance completely, and that belief is what makes him interesting as a character rather than simply repulsive. Calvin Candie thinks of himself as a man of taste. He talks about culture, about France, about education, about the finer things. And he does this constantly, almost compulsively, as if he needs to remind everyone in his presence that he is not just a wealthy man, but a sophisticated one. This need to be recognized is the most consistent thing about him. He is not satisfied with simply having power. He wants that power to be admired, and he wants his intelligence and refinement to be admired alongside it. There is a kind of emotional immaturity running underneath almost everything Candie does. He pouts when he doesn't get attention. He escalates when he feels challenged. He needs to win, not just in business or in his Mandingo fighting matches, but in conversation, in social standing, in every small interaction where he senses an audience. Watch how he behaves around Django and Schultz once the negotiation begins to interest him. He becomes almost giddy, eager to be seen as clever, eager to be the one controlling the terms of the conversation. His confidence is real, but it is also fragile, propped up by an environment that has never seriously challenged him. This is part of what makes him different from a character who is simply cruel. Candie's cruelty is wrapped inside a need to be liked, respected, and admired, often by the very people he is mistreating. He wants Django to be impressed by Candyland. He wants Schultz to be impressed by his Mandingo fighters and his French. He wants his guests to leave thinking he is generous, urbane, and formidable all at once. The fact that he can hold all of this together in his own mind without seeing any contradiction in it says a great deal about how thoroughly the world around him has been built to protect his self-image. Candie is not a stupid man, and the film does not ask us to believe he is. He can read a room. He can negotiate. He has built and maintained a profitable, brutal enterprise. But there is a wide gap between being capable and being as intelligent as he believes himself to be, and that gap is one of the most interesting things about his character. The scene where Candie discusses skulls and phrenology with Schultz is probably the clearest example of this gap. He presents a pseudo-scientific theory about why certain people are naturally suited to servitude, and he delivers it with total confidence, as though he is offering Schultz a piece of genuine scientific insight. What he is actually doing is repeating a flattering, invented justification for the system that benefits him, dressed up in the language of education. He does not understand the science. He has simply absorbed a story that lets him feel intellectually superior, while also excusing the brutality of his own household. This is the pattern with Candie's intelligence throughout the film. He collects the symbols of education and refinement, French phrases, references to Alexandre Dumas, an interest in skulls and theory, without ever really engaging with the substance behind them. He owns the props of sophistication the way he owns everything else, and he assumes that owning them is the same as understanding them. When Schultz quietly corrects or undercuts him, Candie barely notices because he isn't actually listening for correction. He's performing for an audience, and in his mind, the audience is always impressed. This is also where the difference between Candie and Schultz becomes important. Schultz has real curiosity. He asks questions because he wants answers, not because he wants to be admired for asking them. Candie asks questions, when he asks them at all, mostly to set up his own performance. The contrast is subtle, but it is constant throughout the film, and it is part of what makes Schultz quietly contemptuous of Candie, even while playing along with him. To understand Candie fully, it helps to understand the world that produced men like him. In the antebellum South, plantation wealth often came with an elaborate self-image. The planter as a cultured aristocrat, a patron of the arts, a man of manners and hospitality. Grand homes, imported furniture, European education for sons, a performance of civility at the dinner table. All of this functioned as a kind of social armor, a way for slave-holding elites to see themselves and present themselves to each other as refined, rather than as men whose comfort depended entirely on forced labor and violence. This self-image required a great deal of psychological work because the gap between the performance of gentility and the brutality underneath it was enormous. The solution, historically, was often to construct elaborate justifications, religious, pseudo-scientific, paternalistic. Phrenology and related theories were part of a broader set of ideas used at the time to claim that slavery was not cruelty but a natural order, with enslaved people supposedly suited to servitude by their very biology. These theories were not fringe curiosities. They circulated in respectable company, dressed up as science, precisely because they let men like Candie believe that their power was earned through superiority rather than maintained through violence. Tarantino exaggerates Candie for dramatic effect, but the exaggeration sits on top of something real. The film is not inventing the idea of a slaveholder who thinks of himself as a gentleman and a patron of culture. It is taking that historical self-image and pushing it to a theatrical extreme so that the contradiction between civility and brutality becomes impossible to ignore. Candie's hospitality, his manners, his pride in his estate, all of it is the same performance that protected real plantation owners from having to see themselves clearly. The film simply refuses to let the performance go unexamined. The arrival at Candyland sets the tone for everything that follows. Candie greets his guests with genuine enthusiasm, shows off his land, talks about his Mandingo fighters with the pride of a man discussing prize horses. There is no hesitation in him, no sense that he might be doing anything questionable. The horror of the scene comes precisely from his total comfort. The conversation, often referred to as the Three Musketeers exchange, is one of the more revealing character moments in the film, but not because of what Candie understands. He mentions with obvious pride that he has named his dog D'Artagnan after the character from Dumas. He has no idea that the man who wrote that story was black. It is Schultz who quietly points this out, noting the irony of Candie's affection for a name borrowed from a black writer he has never bothered to learn anything about. Candie barely registers the comment. He is not embarrassed because he was never engaging with the reference as anything more than a flourish, a way of sounding cultured to people he assumes will be impressed. The moment works precisely because Candie's ignorance is so unself-conscious. He has collected the name without the knowledge behind it, and the gap between the two is exposed by someone else, not by him. The dinner table sequence is where Candie's control over the room is most visible, and also where that control is quietly taken away from him without his noticing at first. The actual unraveling does not happen at the table. It happens in a back room during dessert, where Stephen, who has been watching the evening far more carefully than Candie has, pulls him aside and lays out exactly how Django and Schultz have been deceiving him. Candie returns to the table already holding the truth, handed to him by Stephen rather than discovered through his own cleverness. What follows is not a calm, calculated reveal, it is an eruption. His composure collapses almost immediately, and his reaction is loud, theatrical, and childish, less the response of a man who has solved a puzzle, and more the response of a man whose pride has been wounded, and who needs everyone in the room to watch him reclaim control. The tantrum is not the sound of Candie outsmarting anyone. It is the sound of a man who has just been outsmarted by his own slave, and who can only answer that humiliation with noise. The skull scene, discussed earlier, shows his intellectual performance at its most exposed, and the final confrontation shows the limits of his power once violence and chaos actually arrive at his own front door. Candie is dangerous when he controls the terms of an encounter. He is far less composed when he doesn't. Schultz gives the clearest contrast to Candie in the film. Schultz is actually educated, actually curious, and capable of real restraint, holding his temper through long stretches of provocation because he understands the cost of losing it. Candie, by comparison, has very little patience and very little real restraint. His confidence comes from never having needed discipline. Nothing in his environment has ever forced him to develop it. Django is a different kind of contrast. He is a man Candie cannot fully read or categorize, and this irritates him more than he likely realizes. Candie is used to people fitting into the roles he assigns them. Django refuses to perform the role expected of him, and this disrupts Candie's sense of control in a way that visibly unsettles him, even before he understands what is actually happening. Stephen is perhaps the most important contrast of all, because Stephen understands the plantation's real power structure far better than Candie does. Candie believes he is the one in charge, the architect of Candyland's order. Stephen, who has spent his life observing and managing that order from a position of forced proximity, often sees threats and contradictions before Candie does, and manages them with a kind of cold, practical intelligence that Candie's performance of intelligence never actually achieves. There is a real argument that Stephen is the more dangerous and more perceptive figure in that household, and that Candie's theatrical self-image depends, without his fully realizing it, on Stephen quietly managing the parts of reality Candie would rather not look at directly. Placed next to Hans Landa, Candie's differences become very clear. Landa is patient. He watches, listens, and lets silence work for him. He genuinely reads people well, and his danger comes from how much he notices and how little he reveals. Candie is almost the opposite. He is impulsive, easily provoked, eager to be seen rather than to see. Where Landa controls a room by saying less than everyone expects, Candie tries to control a room by saying more, by performing louder, by turning every interaction into a show with himself at the center. This makes Candie a less disciplined, less intelligent villain than Landa, and that is intentional. He is dangerous not because he is exceptionally perceptive, but because he holds enormous power within a system that has never required him to be anything other than confident. His ego is large, and his self-control is thin, and in a different context, this combination might simply make him pathetic. What makes it frightening here is the amount of real power resting in his hands, and how little it takes for that power to translate into violence when his pride is wounded. What makes Calvin Candie disturbing in the end is not cleverness. It is the gap between how he sees himself and what he actually is. He wants to be remembered as a gentleman, a patron of culture, a man of taste and intellect. The film keeps quietly dismantling that image scene by scene, showing a man whose sophistication is borrowed, whose intelligence is mostly performance, and whose comfort depends entirely on a system designed to protect people exactly like him from ever having to question themselves. Candie is frightening because his cruelty never has to justify itself on its own terms. Status, wealth, and the social order around him do that work for him. He gets to play the role of a civilized man precisely because the violence underneath that role has been made invisible to him, normalized into the architecture of his daily life. Tarantino doesn't need to make him a genius for that to be terrifying. He only needs to show how much damage a vain, insecure, ordinary kind of cruelty can do when the world around it is built to protect and reward it.